to thank, as Assistant Director of the Center for European Studies and PhD candidate here in the University of Florida. She's done a great amount of work to help make this possible. We're privileged today to have three very eminent scholars of Ukraine, East Central Europe, and European studies to help us, if not find answers, at least to figure out what the right questions are to understand what's going on in that part of the world right now. Keith Darden is Associate Professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C., where he teaches courses in international relations, comparative politics, and the politics of Eurasia. His research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Ukraine, Russia, and Eurasia. His forthcoming book, Resisting Occupation in Eurasia, coming out with Cambridge University Press, explores the development of durable national loyalties through education and details how they explain over a century of regional patterns in voting, secession, and armed resistance in Ukraine, Eurasia, and the world. In addition to authoring already award-winning Economic Liberalism and its Rivals, which also came out at Cambridge, Professor Darden is co-editor of the Cambridge University Press book series Problems of International Politics and actively engaged with Russia and Eurasia through the bilateral working group on U.S.-Russia relations, Onar's Eurasia, Valdai Discussion Club, and other such forums. Past 4 months, his analyses and interviews concerning events in Ukraine have been published in Foreign Affairs, Survival, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Le Monde, National Geographic, the Russia in Global Affairs in Russian, and the AP and Reuters. The title of Keith Darden's presentation this afternoon is Can Ukraine Join Europe? Mayhill Fowler received her PhD from Princeton University and is Assistant Professor of History at Stetson University, where she teaches and researches the cultural history of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. Her research focuses on transnational history, urban studies, the social history of the arts, and more specifically on how different kinds of state systems shape creativity and how diversity leads to innovation. She's presented at many conferences, has several publications and edited volumes and journals, and is currently writing a book, Le Monde, State and Stage at Empire's Edge, Russia and Soviet Ukraine, 1916 to 1941, which explains the creation of the Soviet cultural periphery. Professor Fowler's next project focuses on frontline entertainment during World War II and the creation of the global entertainment industry. She translates from various Slavic languages and occasionally writes for New Eastern Europe. She's taught at Princeton University, Ukrainian Catholic University, the University of Toronto, and the Summer School of Jewish History in Lviv, Ukraine. And finally, serving as a discussant commentator, our very own Paul Danieri, Dean of College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science here at the University of Florida. Dean Danieri previously served as Associate Dean for Humanities, Associate Dean for International Programs, and Director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Kansas. His research explores politics and foreign policy in the post-Soviet states with a focus on Ukraine. His current work looks more broadly at ways democratic practices are used to achieve autocratic goals. Two final points. You should by now have before you or near you a survey. Have they been passed out? We would ask that by the end of this event, obviously not now, if you could fill those out and leave them somewhere up here at the front, we would greatly appreciate that. That helps very much with the center's outreach, the aspect of their work. And secondly, just to give you an idea of the format, each presenter will have 20-25 minutes or so for their formal presentation. Dean Danieri will then take 10 or so, 10 to 3 minutes for comments. Perfect. At which point we'll open up the floor to discussion, questions, comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a topic I haven't been asked to speak on in the past, Europe's relationship to Ukraine. But in many ways it's a topic that's quite close both to my scholarly interests over the last 20 years and to my heart. I started out in college as a fanatic pro-Europeanist, thinking that European integration was the solution to the world's ills. It was going to end balance of power politics, that by the slow process of bureaucrats knitting together the states of Europe would move beyond the nation state and create a new form of order that was going to be peaceful, rational, and efficient. In fact, I went to graduate school with the purpose of studying the European Union in mind. I went to Berkeley to work with the late, great Ernie Haas, who is in many ways the founder of this field. I went astray in graduate school and started going further east and spent much of the last 20 years instead working on Ukraine. I've done several stints of field work in Ukraine. First for the book Economic Liberalism and Its Rivals, which was originally a dissertation, interviewing officials in Kiev about the future trade policy of Ukraine, whether they move towards a customs union with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or move into the WTO and the EU. That topic obviously no longer relevant. And then subsequently looking at the formation of nationalism and durable national loyalties and some of the political cultural patterns in Ukrainian politics that are very much evident today, which involved interviewing former combatants in the Second World War. There was a large civil war on Ukrainian territory following the Second World War, as well as interviewing farmers and regular old people about whether they feel close to Moscow or to the West. So in many ways, in November and earlier, when there was a discussion about whether Ukraine would be granted an association agreement with the European Union, for me this was a bit like two very old, close friends coming to me and telling me that they were thinking about getting married. And my initial reaction was, you've got to be kidding. This is a terrible idea. This could only end in ruin. Let me explain. It's not just that Ukraine is a society that's not based on the rule of law, where law is subordinated to power on a consistent and regular basis, where property is held only by virtue of the fact that those in power think it's useful for you to hold that property and not take it away from you. It's not just that Ukraine is bankrupt and Europe is looking less flush with funds, and that Europe is a society based on law, where law trumps politics, where rules predominate, where the courts play an incredibly important role in integration. It's not just these differences. In fact, I'll argue today it's not just that Ukraine was not ready for Europe, which is what I argued in a New York Times op-ed in the fall, but that the move towards Europe actually makes Ukraine less ready. That the tug of Europe and the effort to pull Ukraine into Europe is very likely to pull Ukraine apart and to leave it a non-sovereign state. And I think Crimea might be the only the very beginning of what we're likely to see, particularly in the way that it is escalating. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background on what I'm going to present, I'm going to talk a little bit about the political divides within Ukraine, because in many ways this is a crisis that started as an internal Ukrainian crisis, and I think a lot of the discussion of Moscow or Putin versus Obama, Moscow versus the West, is losing sight of these core internal problems in Ukraine that are interacting with the European integration process to create some very negative results. And so I'd like to talk a little bit at the outset about those regional divides. Then I'll talk about the current government and how it exacerbates those divides in some ways. and I'll lay out some prospects for the future, and I'll try to answer the question that we started with, which is, can Ukraine join Europe? Okay, so let's start with the internal political dynamics. As I said, this crisis started as an internal Ukrainian problem. It's still, in many ways, despite the Russian invasion, fundamentally an internal Ukrainian problem. And I think in the end it's going to require an internal Ukrainian solution. So we need to get a sense of the lay of the land internally first. I would argue that many of the discussions have been, sort of Ukraine, East versus West, and there's some truth to that. That the core of Ukrainian politics is regional in many respects. And there are two key protagonists in this regional struggle, two historic regions. And so it's not just East and West, there's more to this than compass points. I would argue that there are distinctive regions in Ukraine that have peculiar historical legacies, the legacies of the past empires that controlled those territories, which have determined in many ways the political culture and political orientation of those territories. And that those are quite stable. We see them when we look back at the way these areas behaved during the Second World War, whether they fought with the Nazis or with the Soviets. We see them in protest behavior at the time the Soviet Union was breaking apart. And as many of you now know, we see them in voting behavior in almost every Ukrainian election. And so these maps that we've all gotten used to seeing now, this big belt of party of regions voters going north to south and east. So what are these regions? Let me describe them in a little bit of detail. Let's start with the West. And in the West, I think we refer to the West as a general category, but we need to be specific. I think we're really talking about the areas that were once part of the Habsburg Empire. And those are the three territories: Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, Lviv, and part of Chernivtsi, that were part of the Austrian portion of the Habsburg Empire. These areas, in the late 19th century, the population of these areas referred to themselves as Ruski or Rusini, not as Ukrainian. And as you might imagine, the Austrians were somewhat alarmed by this. In an area where the popular loyalties started to get associated with who had the right to rule in an era of nationalism, the idea that you had a substantial population under your domain bordering the Russian Empire that called themselves essentially Russian was alarming. And so at that period in time, there was a big push in the Habsburg school system to cultivate Ukrainian identity. Now, there was a pre-existing Ukrainian identity, there was a pre-existing historical narrative, but it did not predominate in this region at that time. It was really propagated more effectively through the Habsburg schools, and particularly through Austrian schools. And the narrative went something like this: we're a historic people. We have been historically oppressed by the Russians and the Poles, which is why we don't know that we're an historic people. Our domain spans from the Carpathians to the Don, and we're one of the largest nations in Europe. And we're historically allied with the West. In other words, the Austrians are our close friends. They protect us from the Russians and the Poles. And this has led to a durable anti-Russian sentiment in these territories. We saw it a little bit in the First World War. We saw it quite substantially in the Second World War, and in the wake of the Second World War, where 100,000 men were under arms in these territories fighting the Soviet Union in the 1940s and into the 1950s. We see it in contemporary voting patterns quite strongly, and these are the strongholds of Ukrainian nationalism, often mistaken for the far right. In other words, I think those are not overlapping categories, but sometimes they are. Currently, these areas are about 12% of Ukraine's population, just to put it in perspective. This is not a terribly populous region, but it's extremely important. The other protagonist in this interregional struggle is the areas that we call the South and the East. In particular, the area that was historically known as New Russia, Novorossiya. This was an area of settlement. So normally the language of nationalism is, who are the indigenous people? Right? In this area, there weren't very many indigenous people. This was open steppe. The Tatars moved about it on horseback. Nobody stuck in roots in this area. And when the Tsarist Empire took over at the end of the 18th century, they began to populate this area. And the people that they populated with, some were Ukrainian peasants, some were runaway serfs, some were Russian, some were Serbs, Greeks, Germans. Most of them went to Russian schools and ultimately came to be predominantly Russian-speaking and very strongly Russian-identified. And so this is a huge belt of Ukrainian territory, spanning across the south and the east, which is largely pro-Russian in its orientation, largely Russian-speaking, whether they are ethnically Russian or not, and generally support closer ties with Russia and Moscow. Crimea is, of course, the strongest. Crimea was never subject to Ukrainian nationalization policies by the Soviets in the interwar period, so they basically never got turned into anything but Russians, for the most part. Okay, so this is the context in many ways. The center is kind of a region that goes one way or another, and some of Paul's work in his past life, pre-Dean, focuses on some of this. But I'm focused primarily on the west and the south and east. I should say that the south and east, the area that was New Russia, is approximately 50% of the Ukrainian population and accounts for a considerable portion of Ukrainian GDP. This is a substantial pro-Russian region. Okay, so enter Europe to this picture. You know, we've had contests within Ukraine between these regions over the past 20 years. European integration moves forward. Support for European institutions within Ukraine largely cleaves precisely along these regional lines. Let me just read you some data. Let's take NATO, something that's becoming increasingly relevant, the popular attitudes about NATO in Ukraine. The data on support for NATO membership comes from a Pew survey that was conducted in 2009, a very good survey. In the East, 11% of the population supports NATO membership for Ukraine. In the South, also 11% of the population. In the center, 33%. In the West, 59%. Huge outlier. What about data on support for the EU accession agreement from surveys that were conducted in November of 2013? You would think, in principle, that everyone would want to join Europe, right? Particularly if you're east of Europe. It offers a better life, it offers rule of law, it offers so many things that people try to emigrate to have from this part of the world. You would love to have it kind of come home. Not so for the majority of Ukrainians. 39% of Ukrainians overall said they would prefer to join the European Union over the Eurasian Customs Union. 37% preferred the Eurasian Customs Union, and most couldn't answer or were indifferent one way or another. And as with NATO, the majority support for EU membership is only found in the West. The European Union is chosen over the Customs Union 69% versus 11% in the Western regions, 43% versus 27% in the Central regions, but still not a majority. The Customs Union is more popular than the EU in the Southern and Eastern regions, 59% versus 29% and 61% versus 15% respectively. The East is the last. We see a similar pattern in support for the Euromaidan protests. According to opinion polls, the majority of Ukrainians never supported the Euromaidan protests. It got close to a majority at certain points, but actually the most recent data shows that it was declining throughout the month of February. And again, we see strong regional divides. The percentage of the population that blamed the escalation of the conflict on the Yanukovych government, 49% of Ukraine as a whole. But that's 80% in the West and 10% in the East. Those who blame the opposition, 68% in the East versus 10% in the West. Polar opposites. It's a very divided country. We tend to read this conflict in international terms, that it's Moscow versus Brussels. You know, Lavrov versus Sikorsky, right? You know, sort of this high politics, high diplomacy. But really within Ukraine, those divides are there. You don't need this outside component to gin it up or create it. It's not about watching Russian television. These are very old, durable attitudes. Okay, so what happens now? Or more importantly, what happened on February 21st? On February 21st, there was something that got very close to an agreement between these divides in Ukraine. There was a decision made with the help of European foreign ministers to move back to the 2004 constitution in Ukraine, which divided power between the president and the parliament, and in fact gave much more to the parliament. Would have kept Yanukovych in power and given him veto rights, but also empowered a parliament with a defected Party of Regions faction, in other words, a pro-government faction that moved to the opposition, in such a way that the opposition and the former government would have been in power at the same time, which would have led to constitutional reforms and to early elections. That agreement ended, in part, as Paul and I were, Dean Danieri and I were discussing before the panel, in part it was because of the Maidan, and the protesters just wouldn't accept it. They would not accept a killer as president for another day longer. But it was part as well that those close to Yanukovych and those sort of second in line to Yanukovych realized that tossing him over was the only way to stay in power themselves. And so he had to flee, in part because of an internal ouster, as well as an external ouster. And I think the results of that are going to be quite significant for the stability of Ukraine. What does this new post-Yanukovych government mean? On the one hand, it might be great for Europe, right? Because now we can turn back the clock to November, no more Yanukovych, no more Party of Regions, sign on the dotted line, move everything forward. And in fact, in many ways, the Russian invasion of Crimea accelerates that even further, right? Because it leads many more to think that NATO involvement is necessary. Europe looks a lot better when your neighbor to the east invades you. But I'm less sanguine about the prospects, and let me tell you why. Power sharing is good in divided societies. It can be very good for stability. It can be very distasteful if you don't like the people that you're sharing power with. But ultimately, if you're sharing power, it doesn't mean there's a large faction that's out of power that wants to oust you. And I think that what we have in Ukraine right now is exactly that. So let me just give you, people have talked about the far right in the Ukrainian government. I think this is partly true, but what's more important is that this is the far west from this regional standpoint. Of the 23 total top government officials, 14 of them are from the former Habsburg provinces, those 4. That's 61% of the government, coming from a part of Ukraine that's 12% of the population. 8 of them, over a third, are from Lviv alone. Right? So in many ways, we've traded the Donetsk clan for the Lviv clan, if that means anything to anybody out there. Only 2 are from eastern or southern Ukraine. 50% of the population and a lot of the economic power. Many people look at this and they say, well, this is our moment for Europe. The diaspora in particular looks at this and says, finally, our guys are in power. Right? Much of the Ukrainian diaspora in the West comes from these Habsburg regions. But I look at it and I say, this is a recipe for civil war. Right? That you have too much power, actual power, demographic, economic, coercive, that is not represented in the government in Kyiv. And it's very likely that with a little bit of Russian help, or perhaps even without Russian help, the current government is not going to be long for this world, no matter how much aid we throw at it from the outside. And $27 billion, which is the current figure that's being bandied around, is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money for Ukraine. They spend a lot of money on gas. So I think this is a recipe for instability in many ways, not for European integration. And that Ukraine, before it can integrate with Europe, needs to be integrated with itself. And this government is a step away from that task. Simply pushing on and pushing rapidly to get EU accession and maybe slipping in a NATO presence there at the same time, without pushing the government in Kyiv to decentralize some of its powers, to give some powers back to the regions so that the southern and eastern regions feel like they have a stake in Ukrainian politics and some protection for themselves and their cultural rights. I think this would be a mistake. I think it's a terrible gamble in many respects. Given the stability of these regional divides in Ukraine, it's not like this current government is going to be able to erase them. In other words, not that we can suddenly bring the South and the East along so that they suddenly feel like chucking Moscow under the bus is a great idea as long as they can join Europe. Not so likely. And so if that's true, we're dealing with a region that's 12% of the population and not that much of the wealth, but has some strong Western backing, against a region that has half the population and most of the wealth, and some strong Russian backing. I don't like those odds. And we should not be gambling in that way with a country of 46 million people that is this important. So, to bring us to a close here, I think there is an obvious solution to this problem. And an obvious answer to the question of can Ukraine join Europe. I think the answer is yes, that Ukraine can join Europe. But it needs to make some fundamental changes first. It needs to do decentralization. You can call it what you want, federalization, decentralization. Lots of people don't like the word federalism, but really that's kind of what we're talking about, moving power from the center out to the regions. That's going to be very important to achieve this result. And I also think legitimation through both parliamentary and presidential elections. We learned today that the West has sort of written off the hope of having parliamentary elections in May at the same time as the presidential elections. I think it's a terrible mistake. That this government, because it came to power not through an election but through popular unrest, is not as legitimate as we need it to be. It doesn't have firm roots. And elections give you firm roots. They give it domestically as well as internationally. And so I would like to see that happen. If we don't, I think, if we continue on, I think we're facing partition. I think that there's going to be too much demand in the South and the East to reject the government in Kiev, and there are too many little green men out there ready to show up in capital cities of the South and the East on fairly short notice for this situation to be stable for very long. So I will leave it on that very optimistic note and hand it over to Mayhill. Thank you.
Very briefly, I omitted the title of Dr. Fowler's talk. That would be, what is Ukrainian post-socialism as a cultural model?
Great. You hear me. Thank you so much to the Center for European Studies for inviting me. It is a real pleasure to be here. My talk is very different from the talk that you just heard, which I guess makes for a good panel. I also want to say I'm actually out of my comfort zone in this talk. I'm a historian, and I work on the early 20th century. I work on people who are dead. And I work on archival material that's really dusty. So it's very weird for me to be giving a talk that's contemporary and that's sort of based on changing things happening on Facebook and based on history happening in real time. It's very uncomfortable for me, but I guess that's good. So I want to start with a flash mob. This is a flash mob in Odessa, and this is last weekend, March 22nd. A group of musicians from the Odessa Philharmonic organized a flash mob in the city's legendary central market. This is the Privoz. For those of you who don't know, this is a very famous sort of historic place in the city center, famous from the times of the Russian Empire. And they organized a flash mob there, and they played Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which, if you don't know, is the anthem of the European Union. This act of culture occurred precisely when Russian propaganda is blackening the surprising regime collapse in Kiev as a fascist coup, and when Russian troops are blocked on the eastern side of Ukraine, ready to invade at any moment in order to protect Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens. It's an extraordinary video, and it's actually the latest to come out of Odessa, whose inhabitants have produced actually quite a few videos that have exploded across social media in support of the Maidan, the Euro revolution, and against Putin. Now, a flash mob in a marketplace, that would be nothing more than, hipster anecdote, I don't know, in Gainesville, certainly in New York, Paris, or Tokyo, but in Ukraine, at this moment, it is so much more. It's a cultural act of protest where the population perceives culture as really, really important. It's made possible by a group of artists struggling without state support, but free from the strictures of state control. And it is a cultural product of its milieu, Odessa. In short, it is a product of post-socialist culture. And I'm working with this idea of post-socialism as a cultural crisis. Obviously, it's a crisis in many spheres, politics, law, economics, among others. But I'd like to suggest that there's a specific cultural infrastructure that reflects the warping of Soviet socialism as well. Particularly with Ukraine, scholars, particularly scholars of culture, often use a post-colonial framework, and they refer to Ukraine as a colony. And I think that's wrong. I don't think that's quite accurate. It's not post-colonial, it's post-socialist. And I think that means something quite specific. Culture, as William Sewell argues, is both a world of meanings and a set of structures. And it's how a society knows what ideas or objects or practices mean. It's all about meaning. And it was formerly the Soviet state that endowed ideas and objects and practices with meaning, and so structured the stories that could be told and how people understood them. Moreover, the Soviet Union and its bloc were highly centralized in Moscow, which homogenized and smoothed over the chaos and the ruptures and the minority voices, right? So to move out of that is a real challenge, and actually I see that changing in Ukraine right now. So these ideas come from my perspective as a historian. I wrote my dissertation, and I'm writing my first book, hopefully, on the creation of a Soviet cultural infrastructure in Soviet Ukraine in the 20s and 30s. So I write about, and here some of them are, how cultural and political elites came up with Soviet culture to begin with. I write about their struggle to involve the state in culture. And I write about how hard it was to turn a multi-ethnic borderland, Jewish, Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, into an organized ethnic hierarchy as per Soviet nationality policy. Now, my generation, all these guys died in the 1930s, but the legacy of their work still lives. And actually, as I researched in the archives, as I was doing my dissertation research during the day, at night I go to a concert, or go to a show, or go to a theater performance, and talk with all my very hipster arts friends, and I realized, wow, it's really hard to emerge from socialism. That whole cultural infrastructure that I'm researching during the day in the archives, it's still there, right? So it's very hard to dismantle that. And what's been really striking for me is particularly this in 2014, I've been struck by incredible change occurring in Ukraine in terms of culture. And that's what I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about two of the most central foundations of Soviet socialist culture and sort of suggest how I see them changing. So the first is artists and the state. In very few places in the world were artists as central to power as the Soviet Union. I mean, really, I would be hard-pressed to think of somewhere else. Artists had extraordinary perks. They had apartments in the center. They had vacations in Crimea. They had cars at their disposal. They had dachas. And most importantly, they had audiences and validation guaranteed, right? All those Stalin prizes, artist prizes, which went together with higher salaries. Culture was central to the Soviet state, right? We all know that the Soviet program was not just economic, about anti-capitalism. It was not just about politics, single-party rule. It was also a totally radical new vision of culture. And Soviet culture was created by artists who grew up in the Russian Empire, where the state was not involved in culture, and an actor could get stranded east of the Urals in winter with no money, and where actresses were derided as whores and not allowed entrance to high society. So obviously, early Soviet cultural elites wanted to change their position in society and wanted to change their relationship with the state, and they were very successful. The state took over full control of the arts, and artists became some of the most important people in the Soviet world. This guy, Kornichuk, was kind of a hack playwright. I wouldn't suggest reading any of his plays. But he was also a government minister. He was actually Minister of Foreign Affairs during World War II, shockingly. So this intertwining between artists and the state was very, very powerful. And in Russia, this is still the case. If you go to any theater or theater performance or art exhibition in Russia, you'll see these logos, emblems of banks or major oil and gas corporations on the program. Russian oligarchs support the culture of Russia. It's true in Ukraine as well. Ukrainian oligarchs support the arts, but the way that the oligarch is tied to the state court is very different in Russia than in Ukraine. Most of these banks and state corporations are, in a way, kind of shell corporations for the Kremlin. So these oligarchs are very much part of the Kremlin court, and the Kremlin I think of as kind of a bank for culture. And there's no denying that the Kremlin offers a very, very high level of financial support for the arts. But that means that culture and the state are as intertwined as they were in the days of Stalin's Kremlin. And just as culture kind of dips into the Kremlin bank to support itself, so does the Kremlin dip into culture to support itself. Legitimacy is a two-way street, right? Recently, the Ministry of Culture in Russia published a list on its website naming the 80 or so odd cultural leaders supporting Putin's actions in Ukraine and Crimea. And I call this the Russia list. Another publication actually followed up with some interviews with some of these people, and many of them said that they'd signed because Russia and Ukraine were obshaya kultura. They had a common culture, which sort of implies that, well, if the culture is common, hey, the political boundaries should be common as well, right? It's implying this very close connection between culture and politics. And the Russia list spawned two really important reactions that I'd like to highlight. The first was the reaction on social media, which was a real firestorm. I mean, I myself felt betrayed by people like Sergei Bezrukov. How could I ever watch a movie with him again? And Ukrainian cultural figures noted with particular vitriol the disdain and betrayal that they felt by these Russian cultural figures. And in fact, the whole thing, I mean, the list and the lists against the list and the letters was really reminiscent of the 1930s, right, and the era of denunciations. Second, the list spawned alternative lists. And the story of this list is like a Soviet satire or a Stalinist tragedy. Theater director Mark Zaharov, who's being pinned by Medvedev there, and celebrity actor Konstantin Khabensky, at first appeared to openly oppose Putin's policies. And these statements came out where they said, I oppose Putin's policies in Ukraine. And there even seemed to be this list floating around on the internet where all of these artists got together and signed this kind of anti-Putin list. But then it turned out that these lists were false. And these guys came out with statements like, I never used Kontatia, Russian Facebook, I never said this, I completely support Putin, I support what he's doing. So it's again, this sort of smoke and mirrors. And the reality is that Konstantin Khabensky has a charitable organization. He does a lot with brain cancer. And Mark Zaharov actually has a really great theater. And if either of them want their funding from the state to continue, obviously they have to support the Kremlin. That's how it works in Putin's Russia. And the larger question is, why does anyone care? Why does this matter at all? Why does the Ministry of Culture put a list of 80 cultural figures on its website? And why do people get so upset about it? I mean, I think this is the larger question. And I think the answer is that the Soviet state really succeeded in making artists leading members of society. And they serve as spokespeople for the regime far more than in the West. So their political stance matters more than, say, an actor's viewpoint might in the United States. And here's the larger point, which is that it's really painful to separate culture and politics once they're so forged together, as happened in the Soviet Union. But this kind of unforging is actually what I see happening in Ukraine. There's an interesting video created by actors at the Ivan Franko Theater in Kiev, and they use the same phrase as the Russian cultural figures, obshaya kultura. but they used it in a really different way. They were saying, we have so much fun making theater together, we have so much fun making films together, we have an obshay kultura, so let's just say in our separate corners. In other words, can't politics and culture be separate? Can't we have separate states and a common culture? Right? So it's a completely different understanding of the relationship between culture and the state. So I see this sort of new non-socialist understanding of the relationship between culture and the state emerging in Ukraine where it's not in Russia. What caused this? Why is this happening? Well, I think one of the simple reasons is that actually the Ukrainian state did kind of stop funding culture after 1991. I'm not sure quite why that is, but I think the cultural infrastructure was so centralized around Moscow, and you find in the archives people in the regions writing up to Moscow, hey, give us more money for these costumes, we need money to renovate the theater, we don't have it, give us hard currency so we can have a competition. There's a constant writing up to Moscow, and once in 1991 they were in their own country, I think culture kind of dropped off as a priority. And certainly the independent Ukrainian state just hasn't made culture and the arts a top priority. In contrast to Moscow, oligarchs in Ukraine are very, very important, and unlike in Russia, their separate fiefdoms actually are quite separate from the state. This is one, Ridwan Akhmetov, his fund for the development of Ukraine is one of the major sources of funding, or used to be one of the major sources of funding for the arts in Ukraine. Artists are right to complain about this lack of funding in Ukraine, but the flip side is that you're not beholden to the Kremlin Bank and you don't have to sign the Russia list. But this separation of culture and the state raises a whole host of questions and challenges for today's cultural figures. How do you build a cultural infrastructure outside the state? It's actually very complicated. After the revolution in February, artists and students moved into the Ministry of Culture in Kyiv. And in the basement, a so-called Assembly of Cultural Activists gathered, who for the last month have been trying very actively to reconceive the governmental organization of culture. And currently, it's a series of recriminations, denunciations, and very condescending epithets hurled back and forth between people in the Assembly of Culture, people in the new Ministry of Culture, people complaining about on the trade unions building, which was smoked out and during the events of February 21st through 23rd, and in which people died. One artist has put these, they're very ugly, but pink dots, I think, to sort of mark where people died on the building. It's a horrible piece of art, right? But, you know, if you have a pluralistic, artistic landscape, you're going to get some bad art, right? And instead, you see people who are actually trying to create a new infrastructure, complaining about how this isn't art, this isn't how it's done, this is what the old Ministry of Culture used to do, we need something new. So you see this sort of challenge of, even when there's a desire to separate culture and the state, how hard it is to actually come up with an infrastructure to do so. The second foundation of socialist culture that's really important is centralization. In the 1920s, Moscow emerged as a cultural center, and actually Soviet culture came really to be metonymy for Moscow culture. And Soviet culture generally operated as a model of diffusion, culture created by the center and copied by or transferred to the periphery. With culture so centralized in Moscow, it was increasingly difficult to create local culture. One of my book's arguments actually is that local, popular, urban culture didn't exist in the Soviet Union, in the regions. In other words, you had all Union popular culture, like all Union songs, film comedies, anecdotes, comic sketches, but you didn't have Soviet Ukrainian jazz, or tango, or sketch comedy. Culture was too centralized in Moscow for the emergence of local or regional cultures on the borderlands. Contributing to the power of centralization was the importance of ethnicity as a category, which is a very, very, very important category in the Soviet Union. Zygmunt Bauman, eminent East European intellectual, writes of Europe as a place of neighbors, where the other is never far away. but he himself is a product of the socialist world and is shaped by the socialist understanding of belonging, which is that of ethnos. So for Bauman, the neighbor is not necessarily someone of a different class or a different region, but rather someone of a different ethnos: Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, Crimean Tatar. And in a sense, the challenge that Bauman raises that Ukraine is facing today is the challenge of creating civic identities versus ethnic identities. And this is a real fundamental question, I think, that's facing Ukraine right now. How can a society overcome ethnos as the most important category? That implication of that, of course, is that there's no difference between the cultures of Russian speakers in Odessa or Kharkiv and that of those in Moscow, which is obviously the assumption on which Putin is operating. But it's a purely Soviet understanding of belonging that leaves no room for regions or civic identities beyond the nation. And in fact, I would argue that Kharkiv, Odessa, and even Donetsk are Ukrainian cities, and they belong in Ukraine if we determine culture not by ethnos, but by region. There's a little bit of historical background here. In the 1920s in Kharkiv, so in eastern Ukraine, which was then the capital from 1918 to 1934, a group of guys lived in one 68-apartment building, appropriately called the Building of the Word, Budynek Slovo, and they created something called Soviet Ukrainian culture. They were the movers and shakers who wrote and edited and managed the theaters, newspapers, and journals. They played billiards together, they went hunting together, they ate watermelon together, they drank, they quarreled, and created some truly extraordinary theater, music, painting, poetry, and literature in Ukrainian, designed for Soviet Ukraine, all in Ukraine's east. It was Soviet art, but it was also Ukrainian, and Kharkiv, a city now touted as potentially returning to Mother Russia, was at the center of Soviet Ukrainian culture. The inhabitants of the Building of the Word faced an enormous challenge in Soviet Ukraine, which was precisely the region's multi-ethnic character. What do you do with Yiddish and Polish and Russian if you're making culture in Ukrainian? And these famous artists pushed the boundaries of Ukrainian art, but they couldn't quite imagine their way out of the quandary of the ethnos. A multi-ethnic region proved an obstacle and not an opportunity. And they attempted to solve this challenge by organization. Jews to the Yiddish theater and newspaper and school, and Russians to the Russian language institutions, and Ukrainians to the Ukrainian ones, and Poles to the Polish ones. Every culture defined by language and ethnos, they assumed, was allocated its own set of cultural institutions, organized in a clear and rational hierarchy. The Building of the Word organized culture by words, by language, into Ukrainian, Russian, Yiddish, among others. All three were included in Soviet Ukrainian culture, but separate and apart. And the Building of the Word's assumption then was that words defined culture, circumscribed culture. And the result, I think, was that words limited culture. Almost all of the inhabitants of the Building of the Word were arrested and shot in the early 1930s, and Moscow ordered the capital moved to Kiev in 1934. Odessa especially vexed Soviet Ukrainian authorities. After all, there were only 13,000 Ukrainians in Odessa out of 300,000 in the 1926 census, yet somehow the city was supposed to promote Ukrainian language culture, not Yiddish language or Russian language or Bulgarian language or Polish language culture. Somehow, the Word actually failed to organize Odessa. Now, Odessa was never a Russian city. It was an imperial city in the Russian Empire. Founded by Empress Catherine the Great, Odessa was a port city, and it conducted the Russian Empire to greater trade routes. It was a place that led to the modern pogrom, when Jews and Christians celebrated Passover and Easter on parallel streets. Odessa was the home of many major Soviet cultural figures. The entire world of Isaac Babel's literary creation, Benya Krik, underworld king of Odessa's Jewish Moldovanka, Soviet jazz star Leonid Uchosov, Eisenstein's Potemkin Stairs, pictured there. Odessa was an imperial city, a port, a space where cultures clashed, a hotbed of creativity. Odessa somehow survived because the Word's power to organize failed. Now it's true, Odessa may no longer be the cosmopolitan imperial showcase that it used to be in the 1900s, although one imagines that the evocative courtyards, the tramway rolling creakily out to the dirty beach, and the sex trafficking are not only modern phenomena. Still, Odessa defies categorization. It may no longer be imperial culture, but it's certainly not Russian culture. It's something else. It's artists creating a flash mob in a marketplace. And this, I think, allows potentially for the creation of a civic identity, Ukrainian,
Forget Ukrainian as exclusively ethnicity. See it as musicians from Odessa, who most likely speak Russian and Ukrainian, whatever their ethnicity, who organize a live cultural event declaring themselves for Europe in a formerly imperial marketplace. The idea of local culture does not exist in Russia. It exists in the Russian language, sure. Odessa exists in Russian, but Odessa as a tangible cultural space could never exist in today's Russia. Crimea in Russia will, I fear, become a playground for Russian elites and celebrated for Russianness, ignoring and erasing the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar elements that used to make Crimean culture. In Putin's Russia, culture is centralized. Moscow is one of the most artistically stunning cities on the globe, absolutely. But outside the capital, Moscow still towers over Russian culture in a way that Kiev does not. Ukraine still has a long way to go to decentralize patronage, but it can. Decentralization will not happen anytime soon in Russia. In other words, post-Soviet is not only an economic and political designation, but it's also a cultural designation. Moving from culture intertwined with to separate from the state, moving from centralization to decentralization, moving from a culture that defines itself ethnically to a culture that defines itself in terms of Bauman's neighborhood is a challenge. But in Ukraine, Ode to Joy can erupt in a flash mob, in a market. Odessa has a chance in post-Soviet Ukraine. It has no chance in Putin's Russia except as literary myth. And I want to say two more words. The first is, I really mean has a chance. I think Ukraine is currently at an incredible crossroads right now in terms of how this idea of Ukrainian can or cannot acquire more inclusivity. I have some examples here that have really struck me of the sort of new inclusivity of this definition of Ukrainian. We see Jamala, who is a Crimean Tatar singer who declares herself as Ukrainian, obviously meaning Ukrainian not as an ethnicity. We have above her the Duff daughters, who are from all over Ukraine and yet call themselves Ukrainian. And as you can see, they sort of use Yuki folk, but like transformed for modern times. And on the left there, we see Вечерний Kvartal, which is a really amazing humor show. It's sort of like Saturday Night Live meets Stephen Colbert, kind of, in Ukraine. It's not understandable unless you know Russian and Ukrainian, and unless you understand the Ukrainian context. And it's really funny, sort of. There's like a skit where Kiev and Moscow are in marriage counseling. And it really is Ukrainian culture, but not at all ethnically Ukrainian. And I think this question of what is Ukrainian is actually one of the central political questions right now. And to what degree this far right will be incorporated and how they'll be incorporated into the state, to what degree the state will, on a state level, make an effort to incorporate the regions both into the government and into this larger sense of Ukrainian culture, and to what extent this idea of Yedina Ukraina, one united Ukraine, will exist not only in culture, but also in politics. All of that remains to be seen. So thank you very much.
Two incredibly interesting, rich papers. I said I was going to try to talk for 3 minutes, and I'm afraid they've put too much stuff that's interesting there for me to talk for only 3 minutes, but I will keep it under 10. Two very different perspectives on what's going on in Ukraine. I don't need to lay out all those differences. But relate one, I think, important common perspective, which is that they examine the historical roots of today's divisions that were debated in so many ways. And while they both trace the historical roots, Keith to some extent in political and education terms, and Mayhill in terms of culture and of the Soviet era, they clearly have very different perspectives on where things are now. So I'm going to try to see if I can disagree with both of them while I try to focus on some common themes. And basically my argument is going to be that Mayhill is a little bit too credulous, a little bit too believing, perhaps a little bit too hopeful. And I hate to say anybody's more skeptical than I am, but I think Keith is a little bit too skeptical. Let me try to say what I mean by this. I mean, you can hardly be too skeptical when it comes to it. And yet, So Ukraine, Mayhill's basic argument here, to quote a book by an illustrious, or not so illustrious Ukrainian political figure, the argument essentially is Ukraine is not Russia, and it is not the Soviet Union. This was the title of a book by Ukraine's not lamented ex-president Leonid Kuchma. She draws this sort of strong distinction, and I think draws it too strongly, frankly, between what a Soviet pattern is and what exists in Russia today, and what a Ukrainian pattern is that's completely different. And then lays out this idea of one Ukraine, and this possibility that there's a single Ukrainian civic identity. Keith, of course, sees Ukraine as being hopelessly divided. And there's obviously, he laid out a lot of the evidence for it, both historically and in contemporary times. One of the things I think I would stress to both of them is that Ukrainian and Russian national identities, as they exist in the real world, in that country, are not exclusive. It's not if you're this, then you're not that. And I think that's the essence of how identity politics are different in Ukraine than in many other places. People mix the languages, they change churches, they intermarry, you can hear conversations in the streets in Kiev where one person's speaking Ukrainian, the other one's speaking Russian, or they're both speaking some Surzhyk, some mishmash of the two, or Creole. So they're not exclusive categories, and in fact, most Ukrainians will tell you that in some respects, they are both. And the voting differences that Keith points to are profound, but that doesn't lead to secession necessarily any more than the blue state, red state thing in the United States, although the numbers clearly are more pronounced in Ukraine. There have been secessionist parties, pro-Russian parties, in pretty much every Ukrainian election since 1991, and they never get more than about 2% of the vote. What's happened in Crimea is the result, and what's happening in eastern Ukraine right now, is certainly in part spurred by the so-called revolution in Kiev and the fact that one half of the country seems to have taken over. But let's be candid, it's also driven by what Keith referred to as little green men. And we should be clear, when he says little green men, he's not talking about men from Mars. He's talking about men from Russia. They are infiltrated, there's complete, and they've been laying the groundwork for this for a very, very long time. 3 and 4 years ago, they were giving out Russian passports to Crimea. And it's not that nobody knew that it was happening, it's that, and this is where people like me ought to be faulted, we knew it was happening, we never thought he would do it. You know, we always thought it was kind of to put pressure on them that he wasn't actually going to wake up one morning and say, go take it. And yet he did. So the key question, I think, as we think about the unity and disunity of Ukraine, is what happens now. And in particular, does this invasion of Crimea and the threats of invasion in eastern Ukraine, do they bring the regions together? Do they bring Ukrainians together? Do Ukrainians, to use a common phrase, rally around the flag? Or does it drive them apart? And I don't think we should assume what the answer to that question would be, especially because most of us have hopes, high hopes in one way, and hopes often cause us to miss some things that we ought to be seeing, which is why Keith's cynicism is so necessary. He gets at this question, and I think it is the question, one of the big questions to ask: how will this government be legitimized? It's as yet not legitimized by an election. In fact, it's sort of in part delegitimized by the way it came to power. And there's not going to be parliamentary elections. And it's hard to overestimate the level of cynicism and corruption in the Ukrainian parliament. The people who were in the Party of Regions and were the key people turning against Yanukovych in early 2014 were the exact same people that, when it looked like things were going his way in 2010, after the presidential election, could not throw their old colleagues under the bus fast enough to sign up and give Yanukovych everything he wanted as long as he made sure they got paid on the side. That's what's running Ukraine now at the level of the parliament, and that's the organ that is now getting more power under this new set of arrangements. So this is the question that is how this government is going to be legitimized, and then related to that is how it's actually going to have the ability to do anything. Keith pointed out correctly that there's this perception of who's got power in Ukraine now, and the fear in the East and the South is that all the power has shifted into the hands of the West, and that they're people with a different outlook on the world. I actually think that's too optimistic. I think the much bigger question is there any real is there state power in Ukraine in any meaningful sense? The Ukrainian state think you can make the case, essentially dissolved in late February, and they're trying to put it back together. So there's a problem of division, but equally there's a problem of just forming a state. I'm going to lay out a broad hypothesis now, which everybody can trash me for, but it seems to be that in the post-Soviet space, with the exception of the Baltic states, state power, strong state power, not authoritarian power, but power that can do things. They can raise taxes, can arrest people who are guilty and put them in prison and so on. State power and democracy have seemed to be antithetical to one another. The places that have the strongest state power have the least democracy. And places like Ukraine has actually a fair amount of democracy, largely due to the pluralism that keeps anybody from seizing too much power, and kept in the end Yanukovych from seizing too much power. Seems to be an ability to actually run itself. Putin certainly wants us to believe this, that you can't have both. And that's part of his model, is that Russia, if it wants a strong state, has to not have democracy. And I think he sees it as being crucial to prove that point in Ukraine. If Ukraine is going to be democratic, it's going to fail. And certainly if it's going to be European, it's going to fail. So I think the big interesting question is whether Ukraine can prove him wrong. Keith asked the question, can Ukraine join Europe, in the sense of it needs to do these things as a prerequisite for joining Europe, and I think he's right. But I also might ask the question the other way around, which is whether Ukraine can afford not to join Europe. Europe seemed to have played this incredible, I'll just say, catalytic effect in a lot of the former communist states in terms of getting people to buy into a bunch of things that required a leap of faith that otherwise they wouldn't buy into. The leap that needs to be made in Ukraine is much farther than the leap that had to be made in, say, Poland or the Czech Republic, but not maybe so much farther than what had to happen in Serbia or Croatia. And so with that, maybe too optimistic thought, I'll leave it right there.
One question over here, and then we'll go to Connor over there.
It's an association agreement, not an accession agreement. And Europe has been very, very clear that Ukraine will not join Europe. And that's manifested by the fact that it's DG Relex, not DG Enlargement. DG Enlargement never talks about Ukraine. And so I think that may recast what's meant by joining Europe, because the kind of trade association agreement that's being talked about is actually less encompassing than what the EU has with Norway, or what in part what the EU has with Mexico currently. So it's joining Europe is, I think, overly optimistic in terms of what the goals are, and that may shape how optimistic you are about whether or not they can achieve them.
This is about culture and about ethnicity, which I think both of the speakers highlight. But given the role of Russia and Russia's political regime, it's also a comparison of regimes. So it's about, do you opt for a kind of managed democracy in an optimistic description of the Russian style, or a more democratic style? That's the first question. So I mean, it sort of strikes me that both ethnicities would be kind of facing choice in this way as well. The second is about having new elections. I would just raise, there could, strikes me, possibly be a bad idea to have elections in a circumstance where the state's integrity is cannot be assumed. So you can have basically in an ethnically polarized or possibly ethnically polarized context, competitive elections can lead to sort of more nationalism and state breakup, and that's kind of the Yugoslav variant. So that's just something I'd be curious to hear your comments on.
Let's take one more question and then turn it over.
One thing that hasn't entered into the discussion is religion, which sometimes supersedes ethnos. And one thing that we saw in Maidan was actually this inclusivity of religions. You got all three Orthodox patriarchs, the Moscow Patriarchy, of course the Catholics, the Jews, even the Muslim thing. Is this sort of a sign of how should I say, optimism about the possibility that these divides that Dr. Darden talked about are not quite as deep as we feel?
To Dean Danieri, thank you so much. I love being called credulous. I haven't heard that before, so that's good. Here's the thing, actually, and again, I'm a historian, I'm not a political scientist. I'm looking at the place of culture in society. I'm not just looking at politics and data and poll numbers. I'm looking at something very different. And actually, I would say that Ukraine is not Russia. I wouldn't have said that a year ago. And I certainly didn't say that in my dissertation, but I would say that now. And part of that is actually this sort of separation between politics and culture, the fact that in Ukraine, in culture, you actually see this weird thing happening where you see these sort of Yedina Ukraina things that, again, I wouldn't have noticed a year ago. These are new phenomena, and I do think they point in potentially a hopeful direction. As I said at the end of my talk, I'm cautious because I think the far right is a really big role. I actually am very suspicious of the Jewish element. I think that to what degree Jewishness can be incorporated into Ukrainian identity, I still think remains to be seen, actually. And so I would remain cautious, but I do think that you see moments of inclusion happening in culture that perhaps you don't in politics. But that's what I'm talking about as a cultural historian. And I think that's it.
I think the only statement that's going to be lasting from this panel is, I'm very suspicious of the Jewish element. I don't think it's going to be on Russia Today within 24 hours, but, sorry, not a good joke. But I want to respond to some of Paul's comments too, and partly just to be clear on what I'm saying, I agree with Paul that there isn't support for secession, and that outside of these Habsburg territories, Ukrainian and Russian are nestable categories. You can be both, like being Texan and American. Very, very, some Texans don't think so, but, most do. And so they can be nested. I think the reason why we're moving towards civil war and partition is partly because of these internal fights within Ukraine not being resolved, and so it's not that they want to leave, but that they're rejecting Kiev. Just as Lviv, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne rejected Kiev when Yanukovych was in power, right? So, and that leads to a situation, particularly with Russian external involvement, which could lead to partition, in part because Russia no longer believes in Ukraine. They do not, at least the current thinking in the Kremlin seems to be, it's a failed state, we're going to carve it up. I mean, the most cynical reading of what's going on in the Kremlin. And that's really disturbing. And so that's what I think the country needs to inoculate itself against by being more inclusive. Amy, European accession versus association. There are mixed feelings in Europe about this process. And the leaders on this, Sikorsky, Carl Bildt, are definitely of the mindset that Ukraine will become part of the EU. The Germans, the French, the British, not so much. But there are lots of mixed messages out there about whether this is the step to future membership. And a lot of the promise of future membership has been accelerating throughout this crisis. They've been holding out a stronger carrot. And I agree, it's not very likely. And the agreement itself is very mundane, although some of the security cooperation in the political side is quite substantial, right? So more so than one would think. So I agree with you, but I think that don't assume that the goals within Europe don't diverge on this and that there's not a significant faction within Europe that wants Ukraine in for their own weird reasons, right? The Poles, because a lot of their lost cities happen to be in Ukraine. Connor, culture and regime. Could elections be bad? Elections can be bad, and particularly if you decentralize to the regions first and hold regional elections before you hold national elections. Generally, history tells us that's kind of a mistake, because you get authority at the regional level before it's created at the national level, and that creates the grounds for secession. So Tim Fry had a nice piece in the Washington Post, and a lot of people are arguing this needs to be sequenced. You need to have the presidential and parliamentary elections first, so that people are oriented towards national parties, and then you decentralize to the regions once those parties are are in place and firm, and I think that's absolutely right. On this issue of religion, I think that you're right that religion's another, Ukrainian identities are pretty complicated, and the loyalties are very complicated. I actually agree completely with Mayhill that it's a free-flowing world out there. But on some of these East-West issues, the opinions seem to be pretty rigid and pretty historically driven, and don't seem to correlate too highly with religion, except for the Greek Catholic or Union churches in the former Habsburg territories, where there's very, I don't think I know any Greek Catholics who are not pro-EU. Right? So I agree with you that the Maidan is interesting. The identity, the relationship between religious identity and political identity is somewhat delinked, however. And so that there's a lot of mobility there. And if the religious identities become really salient, and those become major cleavages, it's going to be interesting. But I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing that now. But it's something to watch. It's really, I think, keyed in on something important.
Two things real quickly. One, Amy, quickly to your point, I think you're essentially right. The point I would make is it's not necessary for EU membership to be the end result of this for it to matter enormously in Ukrainian national identity and Ukrainian politics, as demonstrated by the fact that the association agreement started what it started. Secondly, I want to just make sure I understood Mayhill's comment about the nationalism correctly. If I understood correctly what you're saying about the Jewish population is that you're not convinced that Ukrainian nationalists can define Ukrainian nationalism or the Ukrainian national idea in such a way that that includes the Jewish population. I'm not sure. Okay.
I would like to remind the speakers of the second question from Connor, which is one I'd love to hear the answer of too, and then we'll take some more. And that's the whole issue of what is this a choice between for the population of Ukraine? Is it really a matter of ethnicity or ethnos only, or is there really a choice now, especially since we have had the annexation or the invasion of a choice between regimes, different types of regime? I heard an interview with Stetson yesterday, I believe, who said he wanted to give Putin a medal of honor from Ukraine for uniting the Ukrainian population in a way that has never been united at all. And I don't know whether that's wishful thinking on his part, or whether really that these folks in the East and the South who now get to see all this wonderful television transmission coming out of Russia, which is appalling in its degree of just blatant propaganda, whether that can't help but bringing up this question, well, how much do we want that? Let's take a couple of other questions as well. Here, and then we'll go back.
Have been influencing a lot of these more internal domestic factors? Like, has that been observed at all, or is it really strictly limited to influences within those borders of Ukraine?
Okay, very quickly to the 96%. I think it's very important to be clear that Russia declared that actually I think it's 97. They declared that 97% of Crimea voted to join Russia. What the statistic really was, I don't think we'll ever know, and I think it's very important also to realize that those were not free and fair elections, right? This is an election happening very quickly at gunpoint. So to what degree, normally when such a referendum happens, there's international observers and you have a long time to prepare, and there's sort of equal sides, and we have this and we have this. That's not what happened in Crimea, right? Troops came in, gun to your head, you vote. Yeah, and now Russia reports 97%. I would be very skeptical. I also think it's important when we talk about Russia and the EU, I don't think we're talking about two equal entities. I hope the Crimeans enjoyed that election because they're not going to have another one for a really long time. And my point about the flash mob in Odessa is if Odessa becomes part of Russia, that's never happening again. It's not good for the development of regions and the development of local cultures. So I think what's going to happen in Crimea, particularly to the minority Crimean Tatar population, is incredibly sad.
and what's happening to them right now with the passports, with what you have to do to get a passport, leaving, and then you can't get a passport. Violence that has actually already been reported about Crimean Tatars, towards Crimean Tatars, I think is incredibly sad, and I think that it's important to realize when we talk about these regions joining Russia, that's the regime that they're joining. It is very much a question of regime. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what Mayhill said about Crimea, but I do think it's important to note that that population was very pro-Russian according to surveys beforehand. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to join the Russian Federation, but actually, you know, there's a strong relationship between who's in control in Kiev and opinion surveys in Crimea about whether they want to stay part of Ukraine. When the Orange government was in power in Kiev, a majority said they wanted to join the Russian Federation. When Yanukovych was in power in Kiev, 41% said they wanted to join the Russian Federation. So I think we can assume with who came to power in Kiev, most of the Crimeans probably wanted to join the Russian Federation. But I agree everything that you said about the nature of the referendum. The precedent is horrible. This should not have been done. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily inconsistent with what the Crimean voters were thinking at that particular time. With South Ossetia and Abkhazia, in some ways this is similar, in the sense that you have Russophile regions in lots of post-Soviet countries, and when those central governments do things that alienate those regions, as the Georgian government's movement towards NATO and also actually trying to retake South Ossetia and retake Abkhazia in the early 1990s, quite alienated those populations, they can turn to Russia, and you get this kind of spoilers coalition of Moscow allied with this local region against the central government in Kiev, and whatever capital we're talking about that pulls them away. In that case, it was Tbilisi. So that structural similarity, I think, is there in this case. What's very different about South Ossetia and Abkhazia was that the Georgian government attacked these territories, and the Russian government, they killed Russian soldiers in the case of South Ossetia, and Russia, in many ways, could plausibly say they were responding to a threat. It didn't happen in Crimea. In Crimea, there were defections. You know, the Ukrainian Navy basically just went over to the Russian Federation. 14,000 Ukrainian servicemen went over, and 4,000 remained. But that's not the same thing, right? And I'll leave the last question on civil society groups. But I did want to answer this one question about regime, which is that it's not clear to me that if you are a government that is drawn from a region with 12% of the population, and your officials make up 61% of the government, that you're that keen on democracy. I'll leave you with that.
So this question about civil society actors in the international community. I think in this particular case, they were not an important part of what was going on, because in part nobody predicted these. This was not like 2004 where the election was coming, people prepared, and so on and so forth. I personally believe that even in the case of 2004, the international and transnational influence on those protests was hugely overestimated, in part because the NGOs have an incentive to claim it, in part because the US government has an incentive to claim its democracy promotion programs are working, and in part because the Russians love to believe, right, that this was about the Americans in the international community and wasn't really Ukrainian. So there's this weird coalition of people wanting to say that there was a big international effect. I don't think it was true in 2004, and it certainly wasn't true in 2014. I have to say one thing about the referendum in Crimea, and I can't resist, because I'm old and I remember this stuff. There was a free and fair referendum with the kind of preparation that Mayhill talked about. It was in 1991. After many months of preparation, the question was, should Ukraine secede from the Soviet Union? They'd already declared independence, but they actually threw a referendum. The vote in Crimea was, if I remember the number correctly, it was 53% in favor. That was the lowest of any region of Ukraine, but it was a majority. And that's the only real, what you would call democratic vote that's been had on the question. How people will vote in a poll when they're angry about something is entirely different than how they will vote when there's something really on the line. And so, leaving aside the question of how people actually voted and what the Russian government reported, these are not folks known for free and fair elections, but just the circumstances. So we just don't know. That's not the point, right? The point is the Russians have the territory. It doesn't matter what anybody does. They got the territory and they're not giving it back. and Ukraine ought to move on.
I have a friend who works in the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation, and she says that the taking of Crimea, while costly, will have, they project, long-run economic benefits for the Russian Federation, and that further incursion to areas such as Novorossiya is kind of viewed as a toxic asset from her analysis. However, BBC is reporting the Russians have 40,000 troops on the border. Ukraine itself is reporting 80,000 troops on the border. I would like to know your personal, I know you're skeptics and you're academics, but your personal forecast into further incursion or lack thereof of the Russian Federation.
Great topic for a short question.
Mine was the exact same question, actually. I wanted percentages for 3 or 4 of you with troops on the border, the chance that they will actually make a further incursion to either Transnistria or to the east of Ukraine.
My number has been 70% probability, but that's because I committed to that about a week and a half ago when things looked more dire. I think right now we're getting more intelligence reports about it looking more dire, in part because the Obama administration is trying to mobilize support for an aid package to Ukraine and things like that. It isn't necessarily more dire. I still think it's more than 50%. And the reason why I think it's more than 50%, it's not that they're going to necessarily annex these territories in the Crimean model. But I think the Russian perspective is Kiev has thin roots. And if they just move the troops in, they can oust, a few oligarchs and the regional appointed governors, the appointed regional governors, and ultimately they will delegitimize the regime in Kiev. I wouldn't be shocked, for example, if some of the troops moving in were Ukrainian troops. In other words, there was the best Ukrainian troops were in Crimea, and they switched sides. And so, given that there's reference to the government in Kiev as the Kiev junta, I wouldn't be shocked to see efforts at a counter-coup. So I'm really pessimistic, and but I don't think these are fanciful scenarios. Right? I think that the Russians have given up in many ways on the government in Kiev, and think of those troops as a way to exert pressure. So that could be why they're all mobilized and gassed up and have all their logistic support in place on the border, because that is more credible. But it might also be because they're going to move in and oust some governments. The question is how far. Some of my Russian friends say the end point is the Dnieper, right? And that they are willing to move. They need Dnipropetrovsk, for example, that's sort of a key city for them. And some people say it's another river, the Dniester, right? And so that would be impossible, in my view. In other words, from a logistical military standpoint, I think that's just biting off way more than they could ever hope to chew with this particular Russian army. But it's important to keep in mind that the Ukrainian army is not necessarily loyal to Kiev. And you could see tipping away from Kiev in other regions of Ukraine, just as we saw it take place in Crimea. Which is why the government has started to form a National Guard based on the units of the former Samoborona, the former self-defense units in particular, and are equipping them and training them now in the hope that they can have a loyal set of armed forces to balance against an army and a navy that they don't fully trust and is not necessarily loyal to their authority. That's why I think de-escalation is what has to happen here. There has to be some way to diffuse this crisis by giving power to the regions, some kind of negotiated settlement that also involves Moscow, some kind of power sharing in Kiev, because, as Paul said, the problem with this government is it's not clear that it has governmental power. And it's going to have to make some concessions to achieve that. And if we don't, there's a lot, 7 million small arms circulating in Ukraine right now. It could go down a very bad road if you have splits in the armed forces and you have sort of paramilitary groups that are currently being created through the National Guard roaming. It just could go very, very badly, and we should not be pushing it hard. It can't withstand that kind of pushing. It'll break.
I would basically agree. I think that certainly there's one of the major problems is the government in Kiev, which needs to do a lot of work to strengthen itself. And I think I hate to say that I predict Russian invasion, but I will say I wouldn't be surprised because I think Putin is a major player, and I just can't think of a historical case of Russia just packing up and going home and being happy with what they have. I do think Putin thinks of Ukraine as a failed state. I do think he thinks of it as an opportunity. Plus, things are dicey at home, and it's nice to have a bit of imperial expansion to boost morale. It's nice to be able to blame Western sanctions on a plummeting ruble and economy. It actually is really good to kind of calm things down at home in Russia, and Putin is concerned about his maintaining power at home, and this sort of Ukraine mission can help him do that. I think what's been really intense and incredible about the last 6 months is I certainly wouldn't have predicted any of it, right? So to ask, you know, do I predict this or do I predict that, it's hard because the whole thing certainly caught me by surprise. I don't know if it caught these guys by surprise, but again, if you'd asked me a year ago, I never would have predicted the regime collapsing the way that it did in Kiev. I never would have predicted Putin taking Crimea so boldly. So I think everything's wide open.
Putin is Putin, and he's smarter than all of us, and more cynical than even Keith, and certainly more ruthless than Keith. So, however it goes, it's not going to be the way we anticipated it.
Okay, with that happy note, let me remind you, if you haven't done it already, to fill out those surveys, to perhaps bring them to the table at the end of the room as you walk out, and join me in thanking profusely all three of our speakers.